Alrighty. So we are back for the first time in a long time with another Rambleblog. I haven't done one of these in like at least a year almost, if not a little bit longer than a year. But the goal of this is going to be to kind of go over a couple of things. This is, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt Carmack. I am known for doing the US Masters live streams previously, as well as the upcoming one in like 2 days. So I'm also now on the RC, so I do that work as well. And before that, I was a playtester for several years. So that's who I am. But what we're gonna do is what I wanted to do is take some time to talk a little bit about the development cycle, what that actually looks like on the inside, not full details on it because I can't speak for all the other RC members, so I wanted to be able to do it from a perspective of just myself and how we go through the process from where Mantic sends us stuff to how we look at, refine, and process that stuff to then releasing that stuff back to Mantic, who then publishes it so that you guys get a hold of it. Just kind of how that full process goes. And then take a little bit of a dive into some of our responsibilities as RC members, as well as some specific looks at some of the older versions of Northern Alliance and how that started, and then how it got to release, so that you guys can see an actual example of kind of how ideas were bounced around and taken and evolved upon, so you can literally see how we got to where we are now. So first things first, I wanted to show kind of just a brief overview of the development cycle. So starting, in hindsight, I want to relabel this development cycle, not timeline, personally. But at least looking at it for what I had written down, we have the first thing that happens, not every year, because that's the bad terminology. That's why I don't have dates listed here. At the start of the cycle, Mantic meets to determine what they want to do with their projects that year. So we're talking all of their projects. We're talking like Kings of War, Warpath, Dead Zone, Firefight, Worms, Hellboy, so on and so forth, Armada. All of these games that they have to devote resources to, they have to devote time to, they have to devote personnel to, and they have to organize what they want to do with that before it ever gets to our lovely desks. So in this case, Mantic met. They determined that the four big things for this year, there are technically other things on top of it, but the four big things this year were the Clash of Kings book, obviously. That's basically every year. They wanted to do the Twilightkin remake, so the reboot of the Twilightkin list, and then they wanted to focus on a Night Stalker release early on in the year, so with the new units that they had designed, and then they wanted to do a Northern Alliance release about halfway through the year, give or take. We're about a month over halfway. So, and then they wanted us to design and work with a unit they wanted to pitch. Ronnie had talked about the Dwarves riding Ravens for quite literally forever, as well as a redesign of Tribesmen into what they are now. So that was the initial pitch from us to Mantic, basically, on this is what we want you to work on, this is how, what units we are making, make rules for them. And that's basically the extent of what Mantic gives us. I've said it once before, Mantic does not really hold us to any, like, this unit must be broken type standard. It's very strictly, has been said many times by many different Mantic employees to us, that our goal from them is they want their stuff to be playable, so they don't want it so that people just look at it and say, I'm never buying this, basically. But the flip side of that is Mantic is aware that power creep will inevitably drive people away from the game, so they're not trying to have us release stuff that is just broken for the sake of being broken. I promise you, if they wanted to, they would get rid of us, because it would be a lot easier for them to do it that way. You don't need the RC to release broken rules. That's really easy to do outside of that. Anyway, so then we take that and we work on a internal development cycle. So what how do we want to approach these? Obviously, we have deadlines we have to meet so that Mantic can meet their deadlines so that they can get their stuff out when they need it to. So Night Stalkers was the first things that came out. What was it? March, April, May, something like that. I think it was May. But effectively, we were given our deadline. We have to get our stuff in about a month before they release. So you can see that down here. So we then break up the workload and determine how we want to do things. We've been working on Clash since the beginning of the year, basically the entire time, kind of in the background, so to speak. So as we've been working on these other factions, we've been going through and working on Clash factions. We've just been focused on getting these ones out first because that's what Mantic has requested. So, and I'll clarify a little bit later on what I mean by a Clash. Calling it my terminology is like focus army, because focus for me means on the internal aspects of the army. So units that are performing slightly below the expected level versus external balance, which would be things like cavalry in the entire game are not performing well. So we wanted to focus with these mini releases on buffing units in those armies or redesigning those armies to assist in buffing up units that are not performing well, or in Northern Alliance case, to help the army as a whole, because the army as a whole was performing a little bit under expectation. So, upon getting Night Stalkers, we worked on Night Stalkers, we got Night Stalkers out the door. We finalize our initial ideas, we get them over to playtesters. Playtesters then fill out a survey with their initial responses to these units. That's basically what I call the gut check survey. So that allows us to get a gut check from playtesters that say, hey, you dummies, you forgot this one thing. Or you clearly didn't think about this interaction or this, possibility. And then we can take that and then run with it and iterate it and fix it. If it's a case where it's not a lot of people saying that it's a straight up broken problem, but rather that they think that it's something that could be really good, then we request playtesting feedback specifically. So we're like, hey, go play games with those, bring it back to us, and then we'll work from there. So that's generally how playtesting goes in a nutshell. It gives us, allows us to focus our attention on the things that need the most help. So if, all of our playtesters say, hey, this unit's probably fine, and then there's like one person who's like, I really don't like this unit change. Generally speaking, we align with the vast majority of people who said that it was fine, and we assume that it's a strong opinion coming from the offside. But consequently, if all of them say, hey, this is potentially a problem, or even a majority of them say, hey, potentially this is a problem, we then investigate that and have either additional feedback requests from playtesters, or we change it. So that's playtesting in a nutshell. So we did that for Night Stalkers. We then got Night Stalkers to Mantic so they could get their marketing and blog stuff up and ready to go. We did the same thing with Northern Alliance. Northern Alliance took a little bit longer because it was a little bit more extensive. Initially, we didn't know if we were just going to do the units that were getting updated, or if we were going to do, again, the faction focus, where we focus on the entire faction internally. So some of the earliest versions show just the units, but as we determined what we were going to do, that's when you'll see that kind of balloon outward before we scope creeped it back to where it is now. Then we got that to Mantic early, so again, they can do stuff like the video Kyle did, the blogs that Mantic did, basically all that stuff that has to be done. Shout out Ruby's Barbecue. And then finally we finalized and got the TK list into playtesting, where it remained until we finalized the Clash changes. And when I say finalized, I mean finalized to get them into playtesting as opposed to the final version of everything. But we finalized things for playtesting, submitted all that to playtesters, and that's where they've been since. As we prep toward the end of the year, what will happen is once we've finalized playtesting, so once we've solidified the final version of what will go into the Clash book. We'll give that to Mantic. Mantic will work on the layout. Mantic will send that layout back to us to proofread. We then send that finalized layout back to Mantic, and then Mantic releases the Clash book. So, presumably, maybe additional editors on their end checking as well. But that's the full release. Somewhere in the middle of that, just to throw an extra wrench in this, and this is why I call it a cycle and not a timeline, the cycle actually starts over basically halfway through all that. So it's not a given point or period of time, but we're already looking to things in the future. We're already getting ready for this discussion of, what we're going to do with the next year, basically, and what that's going to look like. So, because we have to get ahead of that this time, it'll give us a lot more buffer room than we had with Night Stalkers. Night Stalkers, we had to cram to get ready to go. But this will give us a lot more breathing room for next year and whatever Mantic wants to do with their next year. In addition to that, because that's just the project side of stuff, that's the project. The ongoing stuff that we do is we intervene in contentious rules debates. So we monitor for situations online through all the various different social media, Discord, Facebook, the forums, what have you. We've all got our feet and hands kind of stretched wherever we can. We monitor for basically not so much the, hey, how does this rule work questions. We can answer those if we feel like it. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not our focus, because if we were trying to answer every single person in the world's rules questions all the time, we would never be able to get anything done. So what we do instead is we rely on the community to do most of those, to do the vast majority of rules questions for people. And only in situations where we see a lot of extreme debate over the answer to a rule, so basically groups of players who are known, experienced players, for example, disagreeing on how a rule should work, that's when we might step in and say, hey, this is how it's supposed to work. And then if there's still arguments about it, then we make an RC ruling using the RC account. That is so rare that it has never happened, basically. It happened once really, really early on, and we haven't used it since, because we haven't needed to. So, but the option exists. We, at the same time, and this is why we don't use that as often, is it's less usually about something that can't be answered, and it's usually more of, hey, can we make this better for the future to make it so people don't have to ask this anymore? So we're scoping for FAQ and errata. We tend to focus more on errata over FAQ because errata solves a problem and makes it so that we don't see that question asked in the future. And FAQ is more of we're expecting people to still ask that question, and we're just providing an easy access answer. So ideally, we want to, if possible, plug the gap, not duct tape over it. But that's how FAQs work. We drop those usually alongside releases. There's not really a set method to it, so to speak, but they are dropped simultaneously, usually with a release that comes out. Not always. So, for example, Night Stalkers came out, and we could have dropped an FAQ, but we didn't, because we didn't have enough stuff that we felt was valuable for an FAQ to drop. We did drop one with with the Northern Alliance release, which I don't know that people have realized yet, but we did. There's an FAQ that came out with that. We engage and discuss potential ideas with players. Now, that doesn't mean that we're looking for everyone to come and say, hey, I want this in the game right now, because we know. Believe me, we know. And there's plenty of stuff that everyone wants in the game. There's plenty of stuff that we want in the game and that we don't get to do. So what we're mostly focusing on is we will spitball ideas with people. So it's not necessarily stuff that will be in the next book, but it's stuff that, like, for example, will come and say, I think Scorchwing should actually have 50 attacks. And I would expect the response to that to have immediately everyone scream at me that that's broken and overpowered, and that's what I mean by spitballing. We might not say something quite that crazy, but that's that's the idea. We'll bounce ideas off of people in the same way that other people bounce ideas off of people, because everyone's had ideas about how they'd like the game to improve at some point, or what they'd like to be different about the game at some point. That's just being a wargamer, basically. In addition to that, we check the app constantly for errors, so we're always working with Elliot to try and improve the app and make sure that that's functioning for people. I don't say we're constantly checking it, but we assist with that. We help with that. And then we manage and engage playtesters, similar to what I described earlier. We run surveys with them. We talk with them directly. We talk with everyone, kind of general, like not just playtesters, but like players in general, about spitballing stuff. But we talk with playtesters about potential problems of things that we've done. So they're the early warning system. That's the goal of playtesting, is to catch something before it becomes a problem that we didn't think about. So that's the vast majority of what goes on there. It's less about getting more ideas interjected into things, because that's ultimately what our job is to sift through the various ideas and come with the ones that we think are going to be best for the game. But it's playtesters who do the job of making sure that we didn't miss something, or we didn't do a dumb, as I call it. So we do that, and then we monitor the meta, which I put it in quotes because the meta is a complicated thing. But ironically, this is probably the vast majority of our job, is keeping track of all the different things that are going on in the game, all the different events that are going on in the game, all the different list types that we're seeing published, all the different internal values and what could be tweaked. It's a constant research onto how to make the game better. So whether or not that's bringing down power armies that are making the game not fun for people to play, whether or not that's making an army that's just not doing really well a little bit better, so that way people will, feel like they're being supported and that their army is getting the love it deserves. Whether or not that's just doing a patch on the rules to make sure that the rules are more clean. We are always monitoring the meta to try and figure out ways to make the game better, basically, within our scope. So yeah, this is what the RC does, basically. This is the how to RC 101. It's not a particularly demanding job in terms of like its physicalness. Most of the work we do is research. It is a shit ton of research and discussion. So we do a lot of working with each other on coming up with ideas. We work a lot with each other on refining those ideas. I think that's the biggest part of what we do, is less about coming up with ideas is frankly easy. We do that all the time. We can ask fanatics for like 10 minutes and we will get 1,000 ideas pitched to us. So coming up with ideas, less of what we actually do. Refining and determining which ideas are the ones that we're going to go to, steering the ship, so to speak, that is what our ultimate job is we determine what is going to actually go forward. And then to kind of showcase that, so I have Northern Alliance to kind of showcase an early version of Northern Alliance and how that evolved from its very first iteration into what it is now. So we had, this is version 0.01. This is the very first Northern Alliance draft that we did. This was before we had determined the scope of how we were going to approach armies. So this one only has the units that Mantic confirmed they were going to do models for. So you can see we have 3 different versions of Raven Divers. This is the working title for Frostclaw Riders, for those who are wondering what the heck that unit is. Because Mantic basically just said, we're putting dwarves on ravens and that's going to be a model. And that's all they gave us. So instead of writing dwarves riding ravens as a unit, because that was going to get really tiring to say very quickly, we shortened it to Raven Divers. You can see there's a couple different variants of those here, because this was before we knew what they were going to do. So we have like a Alohi heavy chaff type version. We have a medium-sized aeronaut version. So back when we thought the grenades were going to be like drop them down on top of people. And we had a Scorchwing version, which was shorter range, but it was the idea that they were pitching the grenades, which, to be fair, we didn't know were grenades at the time because we didn't see a model yet. So we had no idea 100% what the model was going to look like, and that can make it interesting to design. But we had the concept, we had the idea of what this was supposed to be. And then you see Half-Elf Berserkers. They got, at this early in the game, we had just come up with the idea for the frozen interaction with melee. We had not 100% committed to the scope of that, but you can see the very first iteration of it, even in this very first draft. And then you had the Household Guard, which is something that never got to release, but this was basically a horde version of the Berserkers, but it was determined to be too unwieldy and just not really worth it. So we ended up dropping this in the long term, but this was one of the really early versions. You have Huskarls, who at the time were still called Huskarls, but they were the new tribesmen, basically. And this version pretty much stayed consistent almost the entire time. There's a very, very little differences between this and the finalized release version. Same thing with Half-Elf Berserkers, ironically. The only thing that changed was Talinar's Household Guard got worked into a unit upgrade, which we can see that a little bit here. You can see that over time, so this was a period of several weeks, if not several months. It's kind of a blur at this point. We voted down which version of the Raven Divers we wanted to do, which initially was version C, and then we pitched a further, more refiner version of that, which narrowed it down even further. Sometimes we don't even have to do that for the record. So, like with the not the Hearthguard, but the Huskarls, with the human tribesmen, we didn't even technically do the extra steps in that because we all just kind of agreed that, yeah, this looks pretty good. So we didn't have to come up with additional versions to kind of spitball and get narrowed down like we did with those. We again see the different versions of the Horde because we were trying to make that work and figure it out. We see Orloff as we determined that he got a new model, so we were able to work with the idea that, okay, so this is still within the scope of just the models. Now we're going to see the big jump, which was we got the confirmation that we could do larger, more heavily scoped changes. So suddenly you have a big shift. This was the original version that actually, in the end, makes it all the way to playtesting, which was Icy Runes was if you do damage in melee, you apply Frozen. And that was applied to a various number of units. And then a couple of other units had Vicious versus things that were Frozen. So we have that. Multi-charge was the focus of that version of the rule and that version of the list. The idea was that it was going to encourage the different racial factions within Northern Alliance, the racial elements, so like the Ice Naiads, the half-elves, the regular elves, the humans, the dwarves, the trolls, the giants, all of those were going to have like some variant, some take on this, so that whenever they interacted, they were either providing the bonus or getting the bonus, and that was going to help encourage the alliance aspect of Northern Alliance. So both a fluff thing, a lore-based thing, a flavor thing. It was going to provide all of that so that it would be more interesting. And then you can see we're still doing Talinar's Household Guard as far up as this version. We actually had, if I go down far enough, yeah, we had the pitch for a Frost Elemental or a Greater Frost Elemental, which didn't go through this time, but hey, maybe next time. You see the first iteration of the Skald getting what was supposed to be, so I take responsibility for this. This was supposed to be an external change that affected all the armies. So this technically shouldn't have released with this, but it did. So congratulations, you get it a bit early. But the Skald, and specifically the aura that was coming with the Skald, is something we're working on with all banner bearers. It's an external thing. But you can see all these different changes crossing the entire list. as, again, we're basically rebooting it at that point. So this is a fairly heavy focus list, and I imagine that will be the case going forward. Is we'll have one list that's kind of the lighter focus, one list that's kind of the heavier focus, and then a reboot in the future, assuming we continue this pattern. But I don't know. That's up to Mantic. The alternative version was actually closer to the finalized version, funny enough. This is like my 5th take at attempting this video, so my throat's scratchy. But this is the Chilling Presence version, which we actually see the first iteration that here on the Frost Elemental, and Icy Runes was basically what became Tundra Fighters. It was Vicious versus melee frozen stuff. So this was a version where you could apply it almost exclusively through Chilling Presence versus the other version, which was exclusively through a couple units that could punch in melee to apply it. So we had these 2 different versions. We talked about which direction we wanted to go. We had different opinions on how you want to do these things. That's okay. That's healthy. So we discussed it, and we initially went with option B. And that's what we see in version 7 here. There are more versions than this, for the record. I just have cleared out some of them so I don't show every tiny little iteration, just some of the bigger milestones, basically, that we hit. So version 7 was the playtest version. This was the one that went out to playtesters. We sent this out. We tested a number of different things. This was the Icy Runes and Vicious version. And then the first version of the formation was included. But what we determined was that this was too complex. Or not necessarily complex, it was not intuitive. It was not easy for players to pick up and play. It was not easy to understand which units had which rule, and therefore it wasn't super clear, and it was basically struggling a lot. So we actually went back and then took option A and effectively re-implemented that. So we went back and provided auras, the Chilling Presence aura. Because Chilling Presence was really good, we ended up slowly but surely stripping out Tundra Fighters off of units. At this point it was called Tundra Fighters. And making it an optional upgrade for a number of units, except for the ones who needed it most. So Half-Elf Berserkers were under the power curse. They got it as not a free buff, but as a buff. And the other units that got it were usually very small, or very specific changes to improve that. And then that leads us to the final version, which is what released on the app. You can actually see, this is the one that was provided to Elliot, so you can see his edit marks on it, basically. But this was the one that you had screenshots taken of for various Mantic blog posts. This is the finalized thing that we sent to Mantic, basically. So yeah, that's kind of showcasing the full process from start to finish. Again, you saw playtesting was only about after 3/4 of the way that we finally got something out to playtesting, and then the playtesters took it and got us to the point that we are now, which is what we released to you. And that's one faction. that's one faction, and all the different versions of just that one faction. So, and technically not all the releases, because again, we have internal changes, which are attempts to bring units within a list up to the power level of what I would call the midline. But we also have external changes, so things that are going to impact all armies equally across the board. And we have intentionally, with both Night Stalkers and with Northern Alliance, there are units that we're going to get additional things, but whether or not that's points adjustments, whether or not that's stat adjustments, whether or not that's rules. But because those units would effectively set themselves better or worse than every other army in the game, we wanted to wait until we could do all the armies at once for those changes. I'm trying to be intentionally vague because I do want to say that like there's stuff coming that was intentionally withheld, and that's mostly to put some confidence out there that yes, we're aware of how power creep works, and so we intentionally reeled stuff in that would have power creeped the armies in our mind. And we're waiting so we can release it with all the armies, so that when all those armies are out there, everyone gets it at the same time. But I can't spoil that because Clash ain't here yet. So, spoilers for Clash. Anyway, that wraps up this Rambleblog. Thank you all for watching. My goal is to, hopefully, if this one goes fairly well, and I can get approval, is to do a similar thing for when we do release Clash in several months' time. At this point, again, later half of the year, so down the line, several months, not next week or anything like that. Whenever Clash comes out, we will. I want to put together another video that kind of goes over some of the design choices of the factions overall, as well as overall game design elements. So those global changes I just mentioned, kind of covering those in more detail and how we got to there, and what problems we're trying to solve within the system. So that way, it's not just us coming out of the blue. It's not just us ignoring feedback from people. It's us providing, this is the thought process, this is why we chose to do this, this is how we chose to do this, that way everyone can see it. That's our goal. So it's just be a little bit more transparent in that. But yeah, until then, I will see everyone next time.